The totality for April 2024. Solar eclipse in Mexico will last for 40 minutes and 43 seconds. Skywatchers in the U.S. will collectively experience totality for 67 minutes and 58 seconds. Onlookers in Canada will experience the totality of the solar eclipse for 34 minutes and 4 seconds. Totality means the duration of time in which the sun is completely covered by the moon. But in 1973, scientists on board Concorde, a special jet, were able to witness the eclipse for about 74 minutes in the moon's shadow by flying in the only vehicle capable of chasing the eclipse, marking history. This was a very complex mission as it required perfect calculation and timings to stay 74 minutes straight in the moon's shadow. Story is of a French astrophysicist, Pierre Lena, who wanted to study the 1973 total eclipse in detail. He already knew this eclipse was to be the longest in history, with a duration of 7 minutes and 4 seconds. An eclipse this long wouldn't happen for another 200 years. His aim was to study the sun's corona, the area of hot gases, where the temperatures shoot from 5,000 to over 1 million degrees. The corona layer is usually invisible from Earth. But during an eclipse, the sun disappears and the corona is visible. But even during an eclipse, studying the corona is difficult since clouds get into the way, so Pierre asked the Concorde test pilot, André Turcat, if he could use Concorde to chase down the eclipse and fill the plane with science equipments. Pierre got the permission to use Prototype 01 for this flight with André Turcat as the pilot. As the moon moves, the shadow also moves across the Earth's surface, meaning that any point along the path will only experience a few minutes of complete darkness. For the 1973 eclipse, the shadow was set to begin from South America and move its way to Africa, where the totality would be the maximum. The speed of eclipse was slightly faster than the speed of Concorde, so Pierre and his team had to figure out how to stay in the moon's shadow for as long as possible before it eventually overtook them. In order to stay in the moon's shadow, Concorde had to follow a very precise plan. The best chance for achieving this was over Africa, but this didn't give the team a whole lot of options for the airports. Most of the runways in Africa were too short for Concorde. They eventually settled on the island of Gran Canaria, which had a cooler climate and a great runway. The plan was to take off, fly south, and intercept the moon's shadow at a specific point over Mauritania, where they would turn and follow the shadow across the Sahara Desert. But the path of the shadow wasn't straight, and instead had a large curve. This would make science observations inside Concorde very difficult if it had to constantly take turns. So Pierre and his team came up with a straight path flight plan. This would give them up to 80 minutes in the moon's shadow without having to make a single turn. Since the shadow would be traveling a little bit faster than Concorde, it would eventually outrun them. So, the team had to meet the shadow at a precise point on the shadow's path, since any delays in the timings would outrun them faster and faster, and so their time of totality would drastically reduce. But arriving at the intercept point so precisely was a huge challenge. André Turcat was one of the best pilots around, who knew Concorde better than anyone else. With this flight plan, Pierre recruited 4 other teams of scientists that would carry out experiments on board Concorde and study the eclipse. Since the plane was to fly under the eclipse for so long, special arrangements were made and many equipments were installed to provide with clear view of the eclipse. Concorde underwent weeks of modifications, after which the fastest science observatory in the world was ready to make history. On 30th of June 1973, at precisely 10:08 in the morning, Concorde began rolling down runway 21. Turcat took off 20 seconds early in order to tackle for any headwinds that might slow Concorde down. This turned out to be a great decision since the weather that morning was little turbulent, and they ended up losing 8 seconds with more 12 seconds, still left to lose before reaching the intercept point. Turcat started to deploy small air brakes to carefully bleed off some speed, which brought them closer to the arrival time, but the winds continued to be turbulent and Concorde slowed down too much, falling 4 seconds behind the scheduled time. In order to recover for time, Turcat briefly pushed the engines past their maximum operating speed and Concorde arrived at the intercept point just 1 second late and only a kilometer off course. At the exact same time, the sun fully disappeared behind the moon, and Concorde was now in complete darkness. Scientists quickly got to work. Pierre and his team had developed a telescope that could measure the infrared light coming from the sun's corona. Concorde flew perfectly for 74 minutes before it left the moon's shadow and landed in Chad. The scientists and pilot on board got to witness one of the most beautiful spectacles in most unique way. This remains the longest eclipse experienced by humans,